Welcome back to the CRP. This is Devin, and I am joined by Miguel Iterati once again. Back to recap a busy weekend in the world of mixed martial arts, world of combat sports in general. Miguel was already on here with our boxing analyst, Anthony Scott Pyatt, earlier today, recapping the big boxing bout over the weekend between Errol Spence and Sean Porter. And in the process of the weekend, on top of the big boxing weekend, we had three big MMA cards that we need to cover today, and we're going to start with the UFC, who took a trip over to Denmark over the weekend. And Miguel, we have a new middleweight contender. Jack Hermanson came into this bout definitely the favorite to win this. Just came off a big win over Jacare Souza, an impressive win over David Branch before that. Jared Cannonier, a guy who really has become maybe the breakout star of the UFC this year in 2019. Began going into his bout with David Branch in his middleweight debut last November, was 3-4 in the UFC, had fought at heavyweight and at light heavyweight, looks physically just tremendously better than he ever has down at middleweight. He's now 3-0 in the division with a second-round finish over David Branch, a first-round stoppage in the books technically over Anderson Silva due to injury on Silva's part. And in this fight goes in, looks better than he has to date, shuts down any of the offensive wrestling that Hermanson brought to the table, looked incredibly patient and composed, landed some really good leg kicks, and wound up finding a shot in the second round in the form of a tight right uppercut as Hermanson was diving for a takedown, and finishes off the bout. And now becomes probably a top 5 middleweight contender. And who would have expected that at the beginning of the year? But what was your thoughts, Miguel?
Yeah, to me, he's like, rewind to about 8 years ago and check out Glover Teixeira and his attitude or his mystique around him. And I think Jared Cannonier is going to be in that boat where not many people are going to want to say, hey, yeah, I'll take him on. Maybe somebody feels maybe they can take his spot or whatever it is. So they'll do that. But, yeah, he's looking like a mountain at that weight class. I think it's the right weight class for him, obviously. We talked about before the fight how both guys were sort of in a similar spot. Both guys on the rise, coming off a fight that technically, one Anderson Silva, the other one Jacare. Technically, those fights, this is a lesser fight than that previous fight. So now you're back into rotation. You beat Jacare of your Hermanson. Hey, I'm in the title contender now. You know what I mean? No. You got another guy with a similar resume as you in front of you, Cannonier. Now, how do you do? And, some of the limitations in Hermanson's game, during his fast rise that weren't there, manifested themselves against Cannonier. And mainly it has to do with, Cannonier's physicality is going to be a mountain for anybody here.
Not only that, but his fight IQ seems to have just really went through the roof. And this is a man who hasn't been training in MMA long. If you look at his body physique when he was at heavyweight, you can tell this man was a strong, powerful, athletic being who had a lot of potential, but now he looks like he's been chiseled out of stone. And there's been a lot. I mean, there's clearly been some serious improvement to his strength and conditioning training and his fight IQ, because he fought this fight incredibly composed. Was the thing that stuck out to me more than anything, is that he didn't rush his shots. He seemed incredibly confident even in the grappling department. Even when he got taken down, he managed to get back up. And when he started to really get Hermanson nervous, and that's what it looked like, is Hermanson, as soon as he got caught, as soon as he got a couple of those takedown stuff, it looked like he just began to really start rushing the fight and really started to really seem like he had a lot of nervous energy in the bout. And Cannonier, even then, still didn't rush the finish in this. He fought this fight like a very experienced veteran who is at the top of the division. And I think this sets up several potential great matchups. The one that I see people calling for the most that I think does make sense, I would love to see him matched up with Paulo Costa next. But also I've seen people talk about maybe the Till Gastelum winner. I've seen people talk about maybe Yoel Romero, and I've even seen people saying that he might be the number one contender at this point. I don't know if I agree with that, but I do think maybe a Costa fight for a number one contender bout for the winner of Whitaker and Adesanya might be appropriate at this point. And when you examine how long both of them have been in MMA, their styles, I think that makes for a great fight. And I'm not so sure I wouldn't call Cannonier in that fight.
Yeah, and I think, Cannonier, like you said, he inserted himself into the title picture, really, even if it's just talk or hearsay right now. Should Whitaker win? Whitaker and Cannonier is, on paper, just an absolute bludgeoning war. You know what I mean? And Adesanya, with all his, style bender techniques and stuff like that, it's okay to put him in with a guy who's, going to be thinking stand up first like Cannonier, even though, like you said, improve ground stuff and things like that. Maybe he'll come in and fight a smart fight against Adesanya, take him down and expose him. So I actually am more interested in Cannonier or Whitaker, even though, Whitaker and Adesanya just has to happen. I'm not going to try to predict who's going to win that. It's a very interesting fight. There's a lot of bells and whistles with it being in Australia in a stadium and this and that and the other stuff that just makes it a really hard fight to call. So we'll see how it goes. But do you think, Cannonier is sitting there looking at either Whitaker or Adesanya and thinking in his head, oh, I'm not ready for that? I don't think that's the case. I think Cannonier's game.
Yeah, I think he seems like he's very game for any challenge that the UFC happens to throw out in front of him right now. And this is the most exciting I've seen the middleweight division in a long time. Anderson Silva ruled this division with a iron rod for several years. After that, it went to Chris Weidman briefly. And then after that, Luke Rockhold. Then it went to Bisping. Then it went to St. Pierre. There was no real solid champion. And now we've had Robert Whitaker, but he's just been, dealt with a bunch of injuries, very inactive. So this division has had a lot of time to breed new talent and get new contenders. We thought Hermanson was definitely on the rise as maybe the best grappler in this division. And that's the thing that I think is maybe the thing that I think needs to be addressed the most with Cannonier now. You just brought up Whitaker. You brought up Adesanya. We're talking about striking first styles in those two fights. Paulo Costa, very aggressive fighter, but mainly a striker first. Yoel Romero, not until you get to Romero are you dealing with a really high-level wrestler, but even he tends to, in most of his fights lately, be more striking heavy. Definitely the highest-ranked middleweight that really pushes the grappling and pushes the pace in the grappling department. Chris Weidman's no longer there, and after that, it would have been Hermanson and Jacare. Hermanson beat Jacare. So he may have just beaten the best grappler in the division. And he's mainly a striking fighter. So that plays really well with him. So we can't say now, well, he can't fight grapplers. Well, we know that's not true now because he was shutting Hermanson down. Hermanson looked incredibly nervous. Hermanson got him down. He popped right back up. This was a big win for this guy. And it just seems like he's somebody that, it's just really come out of nowhere. Because I remember his fights with Ion Cutelaba, which was a really good fight at light heavyweight. I remember his fight with Dominic Reyes where he just got knocked out pretty quick at light heavyweight. I remember some of his fights at heavyweight. He was a good fighter. He had his ups and downs, but he just seemed like he was just destined for journeyman status. I wouldn't have expected that just a year later he'd be undefeated at this new weight class. Looks like a completely different person. And I'm actually very interested in seeing him at least in a number one contender fight. I wouldn't even be upset if they made a title fight.
Yeah, like we said, we got to wait for Whitaker Adesanya, and then the winner of that, maybe they're banged up, or at the very least, you're going to be waiting 6 months. So I agree with you. We're going to see Cannonier again before that. It's a shame that they can't stick him on the Australia card and try to showcase him there in a big fight. That'd be the wrong thing to do right now, is to keep them. Even if Hermanson had won, it'd be the wrong thing to do. And, the guys are going to be game for it, but they already rushed him a little bit, so it's like how many times do you want to go to the well with that formula? Hermanson, I think, could still be a credible contender here, but like most European fighters, what happens to those guys is, in my book, once they've taken up jiu-jitsu, they're always going to be in the ball game when it comes down to the submission and the jiu-jitsu. Guys have shown that with the European pedigree. What they lack is that wrestling base, and that makes the takedowns a lot harder. Hermanson in his post-fight talk, he speaks excellent English, right? But sometimes a word here or there, and he called them naked takedowns. He's like, I was trying my naked takedowns, and he doesn't have a lot of tricks to get you down. Not like a Coleman or one of the sophisticated guys with real wrestling in his background. If they got to get you down, it's a different ballgame. Hermanson had shown some of that tenacity in getting people down, but if you even think back to a guy like Matt Lindland, Matt Lindland didn't get a takedown on you. The bottom line is that takedown attempt isn't over. You know what I mean? It's like they keep coming and they keep coming and they keep coming. And Hermanson, that it worked with Jacare, but here he didn't have that second gear and that added wrestling technique. That's where he's short.
I think a lot of it had to deal with just the power that he felt quickly in Cannonier's hands, and
there's nothing that discourages a takedown more than hitting the guy. Now you're chest to chest or body to body and feeling like, holy shit, he's strong. Man, that's not good for your takedowns,
Yeah,
I agree. Cannonier looks like, Cannonier, I wouldn't be surprised to see him pulling an airplane or something like that. He looked ridiculously strong.
Yeah, and it's just really come out of nowhere, but I couldn't be happier because I really enjoy every time I hear an interview of him. He seems like a down-to-earth, very humble man, and I'm happy to see this happening for him, and I think it's pretty much unanimous that everybody's looking forward to his next fight. Going on to the co-main event of the evening, Danish standout making his UFC debut, Marco Matson, former silver medalist in the Olympics. I was listening to a man on Helwani's MMA reporter's show on ESPN earlier this week, and he was from Denmark, talking about this was by far the biggest star on this card for the local area of Denmark. That was where the real hype was about Marco Matson making his debut. I didn't really know much about him, but he does. I think this headline covers it pretty well. UFC Copenhagen results: Olympic silver medalist Marco Matson mauls his opponent in his debut, and it was pretty impressive. It seemed to me like he kind of got given a good debut for him to go in there and look pretty good. What'd you think about this fight?
Lo and behold, we're talking about Europeans not having any wrestling, and we get this guy.
Yeah, right, true.
So it's exciting to see somebody break the mold. And what happens here, obviously, throughout Europe, you do have excellent wrestling, especially, when you get to like Bulgaria and some of those types of countries and stuff. And even there, the Eastern Europeans, the Russians, the Southern Russians, they've got wrestling in their background. And you've seen them adapt well to MMA. Now, without the wrestling, a lot of like the Swedish fighters and English fighters and things like that, they've been short that wrestling because the British fighters that do wrestling and Olympic wrestling are very isolated, and they're dedicated to that. So there isn't a lot of crossover here, and I think that's what you have here with Denmark. You have a small country. You have a guy who turns out to be a superior athlete, and yeah, he goes to the Olympics. He wins a silver medal. Guess what? Now you have a country. I don't know how many people live in Denmark. Maybe 15 million, I'm guessing. But you have a substantial population of people where everybody knows who this guy is. So that's what the UFC looks for. I'm not surprised they put him in a match where his wrestling was going to get by, but I think that is a key thing to look at here. You might also see it one day with guys with boxing technique and things like that, where they start to cross over to MMA, and you start to see guys with superior technique. Like Marco Matson is really the first Olympic wrestler from Europe that is, especially not Eastern European, that we really seen in MMA, if I'm not mistaken. And that to me is exciting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We see a lot of Dutch kickboxers coming around. Most notably, probably the most notable that I can think of was Martin Kampmann, was a very notable name in the UFC for several years. But then also over in Holland, you get the Holland kickboxers, but you don't really see too many European, as you mentioned, Central European, Western European wrestlers coming around.
Well, consider the Russians and their Olympic wrestling pedigree, and then consider that the Russian fighters we get tend to be more from Sambo, and actually, many of them, tend to be with a little bit of a bouncer, street, enforcer kind of background too, which makes you, able to think on your feet in MMA. It makes you think you can adapt to it and stuff like that. Maybe the techniques will be short, but you don't get Alexander Karelin never really did MMA, even though there was a lot of talk about it and stuff like that. That's because the Russians in many of those countries, once you enter the Olympic realm of a sport, it's like it becomes sacred to them. And so it's like not like they're looking to cross over, and they're probably well taken care of within their sponsorships and things in their sport. So hats off to Mark Matson, because that's going to happen, and that's going to happen with the American wrestlers. You get American wrestlers that are, technique based, and or maybe whatever. There are different types of wrestlers. Everybody who's wrestled knows that. And the fact is there are wrestlers like a Mark Coleman that have maybe A- technique, and Coleman was an Olympian, right? So you can't really sell him short. He never won a medal, but he's an elite guy like that. But Coleman also was the kind of guy who was like, yeah, I think I can deliver 12 headbutts in 5 seconds. You know what I mean? He's a raw dude, and not every wrestler's like that. We had technique wrestlers in the early days, like a Townsend Saunders, who I believe was an Olympian. Even Kevin Jackson, who was very, rugged and able to do that. But at some point, not knowing the techniques you're facing, it showed up. But, if Marco Manson's got that dog in him, like that wrestler dog, hey, more power to him. Love to see it.
Yeah, and it appeared that that's what he has in this. He didn't seem like a lay-and pray style wrestler in this fight. He took him down and beat him up fast. Moving on from here, this is one of those guys that just really kind of flies under the radar. He's been around a while, but he has a pretty stellar UFC tenure, and there was a lot of hype on Gunnar Nelson earlier in his career, deservingly so. He had a very interesting karate style striking game, while being very proficient with his grappling. Gilbert Burns, very solid striking, very solid grappling, and he's now on a 4-5 win streak. He's moved up to welterweight, and people have slept on him for a long time. He's, I believe, 5-1 in his last 6 UFC bouts, and seemed to look. I thought he looked a lot better up at welterweight, and just with like Marco Matson in the last fight we just covered, and now with Gilbert Burns, these are 2 talented guys at this point. But Gunnar Nelson, as good as he was with the name value he was, he's not even ranked in the top 15 right now because this division is just so deep. But so both these guys stood out to me on this card, but they're in a very hot division. But nevertheless, Matson looked tough, and Gilbert Burns, I thought this might have been his best performance to date because of the name that he just beat up a weight class.
Yeah, Gunnar Nelson's one of those guys, you go back 5 years and you were looking at a guy that people were, inserting into the title picture right away, and it hasn't quite gone his way. I think that he's still talented. I think, the fact that he's from Iceland, again, we sort of mentioned it here. It's a small country. There's not a lot of people there, but it's a strong economy. And again, because of the nature of what he does, when he gets in the ring, you have an entire country who's going to watch you fight. The UFC is interested in that. It helps them saturate their name and brand on a worldwide basis. More power to Gunnar Nelson. They'll have him around for a little bit. But Gunnar really, I think it should send an alarm bell in his head that he's not in the top 15, because at this point something's gone a little bit off the rails here for him, especially when you remember what the expectations were around this kid. And, because of the depth of the division and stuff like that, and not for nothing, but Gunnar's also kind of, from what I mean, unless I'm wrong, but, he's a well-spoken, mild-mannered, he's a little bit milky white in terms of presentation. He's not, Colby Covington, So he needs to snap out of it and take that next step, whether it be, additional training, changing his training, maybe. I'm sure he's diversified and done all that. But at the end of the day, if you're going back to train in Iceland, there's going to be some limitations when you're in a country of 500,000 people.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I definitely think that Gunner's been on a skid to the point now that he's out of the top 15. He's losing to guys like Gilbert Burns, who, as I mentioned, I talked highly of him being kind of a sleeper fighter, but let's be honest, he's probably still going to be a mid card fighter on fight nights who's not really getting too much of a push.
Charles
And,
Oliveira, you want to run through a list of 100 guys in the similar boat? Jeremy Stevens, guys. The Gilbert Burns has that kind of ilk. We'll be watching him for a while. He's fun and exciting and stuff like that. But yeah, I would really giving credit to Gunnar Nelson's reputation and where he comes from. I'm waving flags for him right now because this was one that he really needed to notch a win. He can't keep doing that.
Yeah, and I think Gunnar has a lot of potential to be.
Every once in a while, the UFC will have a guy in a 4-fight losing streak, and they'll bring him back or whatever and stuff like that. But the opposite does hold true. There are rare occasions where a guy will be coming off a win, but they'll cut him because they don't like him or it was an unappealing fight, or one loss and done. Hey, your contract's up. We're not going to renegotiate and stuff like that. Nelson should be worried about that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that you brought up his personality. I think that he seems like a very intelligent man, and I also know that he gets brought in to mimic a lot of fighters. I'm sure that he's getting paid. He's a big celebrity fighter over in Iceland. I think that he's got a lot of money he can make off of seminars and coaching and cross training and stuff.
He's from a European country with an advanced economy and stuff like that. I'm not worried, unless you hear, whatever little character defects pop up and stuff like that. But I'm not worried about him losing his money or making a living, which is why, again, there's nothing wrong with going the teacher route, the preparatory route in a gym, a la, the Greg Jacksons of the world, Ricardo Laborio of ATT, doesn't have an extensive competition background in MMA and stuff like that. Gunnar already has a good MMA resume. I'd hate to see him tack on, 3-4 more losses and then try to fade into, his name value is better now than after, unless he can break the schneid here, he's really at a crossroads.
I agree, and one person I would expect that he might get a little bit of cross training dollars from is none other than the Notorious one that's just across that's right in his neck of the woods that'll be paying him some decent money to help him with his grappling and maybe mimic some styles in the future.
Yeah, and the bottom line is when I've heard McGregor, I always laugh and remember, maybe to me Nate Diaz's best moment was the touch butt joke. I thought that was hilarious, and but I give McGregor credit in that I do believe that behind the scenes he has worked to improve, not only on the boxing end where he's gone to Irish, boxing people for fight strategy and things like that, which he's been excellent with. But I do credit him with going. When you hear, hey, he's training with Gunnar Nelson, I think that's a great sign. It's not Gunnar Nelson is not a charlatan in any way, shape, or form. I thought that was a plus for McGregor. Gunnar is at the crossroads where he still has his reputation and he still has value. He doesn't want to lose. He doesn't want to be working for 20 cents on the dollar either because he let himself slide and ended his career on a 6-fight losing streak. So if that's what's coming, I'd rather not see it.
I agree. Moving on from here, we seem to be starting off these fights talking about the opponent, and I do want to talk a little about Khalil Roundtree because this is a guy who seems to just, if there's one fighter right now that's just defining up, looks really impressive and then gets knocked out. Looks really impressive, gets knocked out. Joe Rogan even had Khalil Roundtree Jr. on his podcast after his last fight with Eric Anders, and that came off the heels of getting just ran through by Johnny Walker. In response to that, Roundtree moves to Thailand, really sharpens his Muay Thai up because Johnny Walker was hurting him so bad in the clinch with elbows and knees, knocked him out in the first round, ran through him, comes back, looks amazing against Eric Anders. In this fight, looked composed, looked confident. Ian Kusalaba looked on the outset like he had a lot of nervous energy, was really trying to psych himself up. Roundtree landed some really good elbows in close, looked calm, but nevertheless, it was just not enough. And Kutalaba is another guy in his last fight coming into before this. They brought him in. He was one of these guys that they've thrown against Glover Teixeira as kind of like, oh, we're going to make a name off of Glover with this young 25-year-old who's an aggressive powerhouse, and we're going to make a new star in the light heavyweight division off of Glover. Well, that didn't turn out well, but he has responded to that very well, clearly, because he looked better than he ever has. And keep in mind, this man's only 25 years old. We all know that the higher weight classes in MMA lose more than the lower elite. So, he's got a lot of potential. I still think Roundtree does too. But nevertheless, this was Kutalaba's night, and he ran through Roundtree. And I think that there should be a number next to Kutalaba's name. I think this another thing we've talked about Glover Teixeira here recently. It shows that Glover's not dead, because this is a tough kid, very tough powerhouse kid, athletic kid, and not only with good heavy striking, but also showed that he can take somebody down and elbow their face in. Yeah. So good win for Kutalaba, and I think Glover Teixeira indirectly comes out looking even better right now.
Yep, and here's the bottom line to me is I think in many ways this kid Kutalaba to me is an exciting up and comer from Europe, and I mean the bottom line is nowadays you get into talking about race and racism and ethnicities and cultures and things like that, and all of a sudden you're in an argument or a nightmare of a conversation, but I do think that type of thing does have a place in sport. And we've been talking about a couple of fighters that resonate with their home countries and things like that. When you can bring the home country, if you're Romanian, why would you root for this guy? And why is, so I'll leave it at that. I think that the guy is exciting. And when you consider the background of the countries that he's from, I think even in his fight with Glover, where Glover just out-experienced him and showed him, I think we're looking at a guy that probably would be fighting under a bridge for $50 if MMA didn't exist. And sometimes, I don't think that's the case with a guy like Rashid Evans, for example. You know what I mean? I think this guy's got that part in him. I think that's worth watching. In the Glover fight, he sometimes toed the line with, breaking rules and stuff like that. And he does have to be careful. You don't want to get into, MMA has been pretty much devoid of rule breakers, aside from that Brazilian who couldn't stop, who couldn't let go of his leg locks. I forget his name, but everybody should more or less remember who I'm talking about.
Paul Harris.
I did exactly. But I don't want to put Kutalaba in there because you got to react now that you've got that little bit of a reputation. But I think that's good. A guy that quid pro quo. You do something stupid, this guy's not going to be like, whoa, or break down in a fight. He's going to respond. I like that. I like having that little bit of street dog and competition in him, and I think he brings all of that. I think some of those guys come in with false confidence too, but that false confidence carries you in many fights and stuff like that. When you're in a war like with Teixeira and things aren't going your way, you're still battling for 15 minutes. I think this guy's got a lot of potential.
Absolutely, and I like to see it because he's young, he's aggressive, he's exciting, he's intense. I hope that he polishes up his style a little bit because I've been saying it forever. Heavyweight and light heavyweight need some new talent. We've kind of seen it. The Johnny Walkers, the Alexander Rakicks, they're coming up. Dominic Reyes, but I want to see a handful, 5 to 10 at least, of elite new talent coming into this division that are going to be around for the next 5-10 years that we can get excited for. But one little fun fact on this night with Kutalaba looking so impressive, that was one of Jared Cannonier's wins at light heavyweight. Was a very tough fight over Ian Kutalaba, which was a great fight. That was actually the first time I can remember seeing either one of those guys, and Cannonier was very impressive that night. But moving on, here we got my final fight on the UFC on ESPN+18 card that I want to cover. For the fourth time, 6 times the Von Flue choke has been successfully applied and finished a fight inside the UFC. 4 times it's been at the hands of Ovince SaintPreux. I did not expect him to win this fight over a very tough Mikel Oleksiejczuk, who I've seen throwing amazing body shots, running through guys. young upstart kid, and I've been seeing OSP really starting to slide backwards. Oleksiejczuk came out very strong in this fight, throwing very heavy shots, attacking the body. OSP looked incredibly composed and experienced in there, and then ends up hitting the Von Flue choke in the second round. This is officially no longer the Jason Von Flue choke. This is the SaintPreux choke at this point. And
I saw that, and I agree. I think I think he deserves it. I think maybe it's just circumstance and stuff like that. But Ovince SaintPreux has that Jared Cannonier type of potential. He's a guy that, again, we've seen him take fights on short notice. He can hang with just about anybody that you put him in there with. He rarely gets wiped out and stuff like that. Now, you start to add things and get dangerous and stuff like that. If he ever got his stuff together completely, you're talking about another mountain of a guy. I'd like to see him take that next step the way Cannonier did, over the course of his last two fights. We'll see once they step up the competition again if he fades again.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to come down to fight IQ, but yeah, I mean, people forget that this man went 5 rounds with John Jones, and what many people believe was John Jones' worst fight. And on top of that, he did level Corey Anderson, who's a top contender in this division, with a nasty head kick a few years back. But he's had his ups and downs. He's been very inconsistent. I don't like seeing that out of a top elite fighter. But nevertheless, he looked great in this last fight and showed that these young upstarts, that he's got a good fight IQ, got a lot of skill, and he can hang in there with them. We got 2 Bellator cards that we're going to recap now, and we're going to start with the Friday card, Bellator 227. Not a whole lot to talk about, but, we're going to give a little bit of a rundown with it. Main event of the night was Conor McGregor's Irish buddy, James Gallagher, young kid that Bellator's really been grooming, goes in and in 35 seconds pulls off a guillotine choke over Roman Salazar. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to Bellator 228 that happened last night, when we talk about a little bit about AJ McKee, a 15-0 24-year-old who's fought all 15 of his professional fights inside Bellator. Here they have James Gallagher, 10-1, 22 years old, a very reminiscent of Conor McGregor and his personality, the way he conducts an interview, the way he talks about himself. This, in my opinion, I've been saying it for a long time, whether it's with Aaron Pico, whether it's with Pitbull Ferreira right now, whether it's with AJ McKee coming up, or now James Gallagher. Bellator moving forward in the long game has to produce their own in-house talent that aren't UFC knockoffs. They've got to get new developing talents, throw their money behind them. I love that Julia Budd's fighting Chris Cyborg. I love that they have a Lima McFarlane. I love that they have James Gallagher and they're putting money behind him. Aaron Pico, I thought, was the right move to go, but they pushed him a little too fast. What they got going on with Pitbull, who's never fought in the UFC, and I think is Bellator's best fighter. Michael Venom Page is another one. Douglas Lima is another one. That's what's going to advance Bellator, is having these new names that have never fought in the UFC. They're not UFC knockoffs who were top 5, top 10 competitors who couldn't win the belt there. These are young, talented kids. I actually don't mind that they're having a Friday night card in Ireland with this young 22-year-old James Gallagher, who's got a good personality, has a good fan base, and letting him, fight, just get some experience under his wings and try to build him up that way. So I don't hate on this. I mean, is this kid ready to be a champion? Absolutely not. But he is a solid young fighter with a lot of potential. He's only 22 years old. He's gonna have a lot of money and good fighters around him, and a lot of experience around him, grooming him. And Bellator definitely has their eggs in his basket. So I think this is a good move. I think the Bellator needs to continue to try to groom properly. I hope they learn from the Aaron Pico fiasco of pushing these young fighters way too fast. But I think that they need to groom these fighters properly, and I think it will pay off in the long run. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, here there are a couple of things. Bellator's model is broken, and they'll never be able to match what the UFC does until their calendar gets set by the matchmaker or the Bellator entity and not the television company. The bottom line is that's how you get, back-to-back shows on the Zone or Spike or wherever the heck they appear nowadays and stuff. But, back-to-back nights, and then we could go 6-7 weeks at times without seeing another Bellator show. That's not good for the roster. That's not good for organization or anything like that. And it has to do with the fact is they're owned by Viacom, so they're married to one TV show. The UFC, we're on Spike, and then when they outgrew Spike, they expanded, and they were also on Fox Sports, and then they were also, every once in a while appearing on other, outlets and channels and things like that on the big Fox channel for big shows and things like that. They diversified, and when the Fox contract ended, it went to ESPN. But, if they needed fights, hey, they're looking for another contract. They have the flexibility to do it, and now you have what you have in UFC, weekly shows. Bellator can't support the development that you're talking about unless they're getting to the point where they can give people fights, on a calendar basis and have the ability to replace fights and things like that. That's what they're absent right now. Now, I'm okay with Gallagher. The problem is, here's the one part. You're right. I think, it's a direction they've chosen in. The reason it's a little bit distasteful is the McGregor part. It's, for lack of a better word, it's uncreative, because this is what I don't know if McGregor or anybody else is realizing this, but this is what's happened. You look in the rearview mirror of your car, Connor, and that $100 million payday with McGregor is further and further and further away. And you've returned to the UFC and you didn't make $100 million for that fight. And, you're probably looking at making less for your next fight. And James Gallagher copying and doing everything like his mentor. When did Conor McGregor become a mentor? Who's mentoring him? He's still, is he done that he's mentoring people, or does he still need mentoring because he's coming off a loss? So all of a sudden he's, got a different hat on and stuff like that. But let me tell you, here's the breaking news. James Gallagher copying the gimmick will never make $100 million, ever copying the gimmick. Everybody who copies that gimmick now is slated to make less. That's the way it works in the cycle of sport forever. So I prefer to see something a little more creative than just a carbon copy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think they're trying to pivot and try to sell that as this is the Irish persona. That this is not a Conor McGregor thing. This is an Ireland thing. This is an Irish pride type of personality that we're going to be boisterous and aggressive and cocky.
I'm okay with that. That's the right way to market Irish people. The passion that you get from those fans and stuff like that is something that's immeasurable. It's something that's priceless to the sport. It shows what I talked about earlier in the podcast. Don't deny the ethnicity of these sports. If you're an Irish guy and you're rooting for an Irish person, guess what? Why bring up racism? Why not? Why can't he just be a fan? And then the same thing applies across, countries, across races, And so take it for a positive and stuff like that. And all of the Irish, everything is positive there. But the blatant grabbing of McGregor's coattails is what's distasteful here. It doesn't even need to be done. Gallagher with a little twist and a little separation from McGregor would make himself a lot more appealing to me anyway.
I think that'll happen over time when he gets his own persona built up.
At some point, Conor can't show up at Bellator shows if the UFC catches wind of that, and or he's got a fight coming up. You won't see him there anymore either. Yeah, so I agree with you. But that's the one thing that's. I mean, that guy, like I said, that $100 million is a long, long time ago now.
Well, I think they knew that was a one-time flight. That's why they had to make it happen. Moving on, though, on this card, we had another in-house Bellator talent get back into the win column, and with his patented style, flying knee. I always remember the worst flying knee I've ever seen in my life was Michael Venom Page's knockout over Evangelisto Cyborg, where he literally caved in the front part of his skull, and Cyborg had to be rushed to emergency surgery. Venom Page gets back in the win column, completely outmatched style fight here. I mean, it wasn't even a competitive fight, but this is definitely Bellator, I think, in protecting their investment, to say the least. I think that they had a lot of promotional money put into Venom Page. Venom Page gets beat in a very tough knockout loss over Douglas Lima. I think they were kind of hoping that he would be the one that's in there with Rory McDonald right now, getting ready to fight for the welterweight Grand Prix, and I would think they wanted him to win it, so they would have an undefeated homegrown star that's the new champion of the welterweight division. But nevertheless, it didn't work out. But I still think he's a very, very tough fighter. I mean, obviously an incredibly talented striker. And he gets back in the win column here. And he's another, like I said, the theme that I see on this Bellator 227 card with Gallagher and with Venom Page is, especially with those two fights, is these are homegrown talents. They're under the Bellator umbrella. They're young. They're crafty. They've got big personalities. And Bellator is giving them a platform to go and win.
Yeah, I agree. The problem with some of this talent, and this goes with both companies and stuff like that, is that they're not purely developing fighters. You know, there's that if somebody catches fire, they try to run with it that way. Now, in the case of Michael Page, I think that they have dedicated a great deal of effort into bringing him along and stuff, and he has, you know, in general, risen to the occasion, except for the one loss with Lima. But the loss with Lima was very predictable in that we hadn't seen him fight ground guys yet. You know, so at some point, if you're matchmaking with a guy to an advantage, when he's in a fight where that's not there, it may show up. And it did show up, and that's one of the things that there's no better way to prepare a guy than to have him in the ring. And Michael Page, you know, maybe you know, if he had been, you know, what you said, 15-0 or whatever, let's say it was 50-0, maybe if he was 12-3, he'd have been a better fighter.
Mm-hmm. I do think that people do tend to come back better from losses and learn a little bit from their losses. Somebody that's a little bit more experienced, and I'm actually very much looking forward to Rory McDonald's fight with Douglas Lima, and Lima kind of knocked Page back to down to earth a little bit. Venom Page did take
not at our level yet. That's what he said. You know.
Yeah, and he handled that loss with great class and grace. He even poked fun of himself. He shared like a little video that was it was like somebody like slipping on a banana peel or something and getting hit. And he was like, this was me in my last fight. Like, it was actually really, when I saw that, I started noticing, okay, so MVP's persona is kind of an act. He's actually very humble because that was
he gets it. He's got that in factor. So like I you know, hopefully, obviously, you know, they don't give up on him, but at some point, you know, there should be a conversation where they're telling him, you know, spend a year and a half doing this, and we're going to work you back up to a Lima rematch, and we'll see how it goes when you've got more experience. So yeah, like I said, very interesting. It's one of the conundrums there. And as far as, you know, if you haven't seen it, go back and look at the Cyborg fight and the caved-in head, because, you know, it reminds me of, like, you know, archaeological footage of them, you know, a skull with like a hole in it or something like that, you know, when that kind of thing. It's like, this was the victim of extreme violence, and, you know, we got to see that firsthand in really a shocking video.
Yeah, and I think it's even hard to watch. You can hear it, but I think that we're probably looking at Venom Page moving on from here. I still think that he's right there in the handful of guys that could fight the winner of Lima and McDonald after this. But you've still got possible rematch with Paul Daly, I think, would sell. Maybe a fight with Andrei Koreshkov, I think, is there. But I actually think what's most likely is a fight with the last guy I'm going to cover from Bellator 227, former UFC lightweight champion who was back at the win column, Benson Henderson, who spoiled Miles Jury's debut in Dublin. When it comes to Benson Henderson, he has fought at 170 pounds in Bellator and didn't have too much success. He went back down to lightweight for this bout. I don't know how if he's gonna stay there. He is 35 years old right now. He looked good in this fight, but I still think that there's a possibility that he could go back up to welterweight, and I think a fight with MVP would actually be very interesting between those two at welterweight. And but I do want to talk a little bit about the narrative that we just covered Gallagher and Page. Bellator talents. When you think of James Gallagher and Michael Venom Page, you think Bellator. When you think of Benson Henderson, you think of, the former UFC champion that went to Bellator. Totally different in how they're marketed and how they can be marketed. Benson Henderson right now being the champion of Bellator would actually be counterproductive, I think, to Bellator. I think that him losing to somebody like Patricia Pitbull or Michael Chandler, or going back up to welterweight and losing to a Douglas Lima or a Koreshkov, which he lost to, and he's lost all three of those guys just coincidentally. He lost to Pitbull, he lost to Chandler, and he lost to Koreshkov. That's a good thing for Bellator. And so because these UFC knockouts like Ryan Bader going in and dominating those higher weight classes, doing nothing for Bellator. They're literally out there promoting cross promotions with. DC was champion and Stipe now, and I think I saw something with Scott Coker saying that he thinks Ryan Bader would beat Stipe and stuff. Like, you can think that all day long, but no, the public's not going to buy that. That will never be a fan crossover fight, because we've seen Ryan Bader in the UFC, and he was a great fighter, but he wasn't a top 2 or 3 light heavyweight.
He gets to go to Bellator. He gets to move up. Sometimes I don't know where nutrition or steroids or those types of checks, but Bader has improved the shape and conditioning and power that he's shown. So Scott Coker can talk all he wants. Right there, you touched upon here. 26 years into the birth of the sport and stuff, and we're already a fractured mess. The situation to me is, I look at Michael Venom Page, and if I'm just purely matchmaking, Israel Adesanya and him, maybe Page moving up a little bit, Adesanya at a catch weight, that to me is a fight we'll never see under the current circumstances, and we wouldn't even think of it, or if I mention it as a possibility, people say, oh no, they'll never, UFC, you can't. Just that limitation is a problem for the sport, because what Bellator has to do is they have to get to the point where they develop guys enough where the question exists in the people's minds. Like you said, it's not there right now. Everybody knows they have a B roster and they can't go head-to-head with the UFC guys. Or at least that's the impression, right? How do you change that impression? Consistency, which they don't have, and, a schedule and, a few things like that. But when they have a guy like Page, you got to bring them along. You can't just match make soft and rush him into the title picture, and then you wind up with a debacle. Like I said, Page against Adesanya, it's just an interesting match on paper. Their styles, it could be boring, but I don't think it would be. But the thing is right there, that fight's just a non-starter. We're never going to get to see it as of current circumstances right now. And until you have that crossover, we'll never really know. Benson Henderson, to me, again, now you're talking about a veteran who's fought the last 10 years of his career at the level he's fought it at. The guy on any given day could beat it. I wouldn't be surprised if you could stick him in and he beat Cerrone, or if he got funky and caught Gaethje. Maybe that he's not there yet or anymore, but that's what they want. That's what Bellator needs, for these guys to come over, hold up water, but not win every fight. And for people to say, hey, the guys are hanging pretty good, and that's their roster. But yeah, they're so far removed from that that next time we see them, they'll be doing kickboxing in Italy.
Yeah, but the thing with the Benson Henderson thing, when I look at him and this model of old UFC champs and popular names moving over to Bellator, is I'm thinking of him getting submitted and losing his belt to Anthony Pettis. I'm thinking of him losing the third fight that he had with Donald Cerrone. I'm thinking of RDA going in and knocking him out. Like, this was prior to RDA being the lightweight champion. It went from Benson Henderson to Pettis to RDA to Eddie, then to the Conor days, and now we got the Khabib era. So Benson Henderson, I'm looking at like he's, 5 years ago with the UFC, 5-6 years ago. But as it's really worked out with Benson Henderson. It didn't work out for Bellator with Ryan Bader. With Ryan Bader, they're just kind of stuck trying to market him as like the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world when everybody knows that's not true. With Benson Henderson, they brought him over, and he's gotten beat by the top guys that they put him in. He got beat by Koreshkov at welterweight, and Chandler and Pitbull beat him at lightweight. But I still think that he's a recognizable name that could be used to maybe sharpen up some of these other faces that they're trying to groom somebody like an MVP while actually still being kind of a good, decent test. But you did touch a little bit on there about something about Bellator needs to have fighters that are so good and where they're at that people are wanting to see a crossover fight. They're wanting to see that. That's when Bellator, Bellator's really arrived, is when the popular fans in the UFC or in America are looking at Bellator and UFC and they're saying, I want to see the Bellator champ fight the UFC champ. We will get there because I think that there's examples of that happening right now. But I do want to shift focus a little bit to Bellator 228. We'll get this out of the way real quick. This was a rematch. Gegard Mousasi gets the split decision nod over Lyoto Machida. And I want to be technical here, so I want to find exactly when they fought last. They fought back in 2014, back in February 2014, and Mousasi lost a unanimous decision then. And now he comes back and wins a split decision over Machida. This is coming off his loss to the new Bellator champion, Rafael Lovato Jr., who is an undefeated Bellator middleweight champion now. Gegard Mousasi, somebody I've said for years, I believe is one of the most underrated fighters in mixed martial arts history. He's always a name that tends to be forgotten about. This was a good fight, and both these guys, I think, are a little bit past their prime. Definitely Machida more than Mousasi, but he showed that he can still hang because I still think a lot of Mousasi. I still think Mousasi can win the fight against Lovato. I think he kind of gave that fight away. In that was a very back and forth good fight. I had 3 rounds to 2 for Lovato, but it was very close. But this was a good win to get Mousasi back in the win column and almost guarantees that it'll set him up for another chance to become the champion of this division. But even him. I mean, before the Lovato fight, I was saying that he's somebody. If there's one crossover fight that I would want the most from Bellator to UFC, it would be Mousasi against Whitaker, Romero, Adesanya, one of these elites at middleweight.
Yeah, Mousasi can be up and down. He's a guy that even at a young age had a ton of experience and put in a lot of work. I think he's upwards of 50 fights now and that sort of stuff. Machida, this fight, like I said, the original was probably something where if it had happened 3-4 years, in 2010, we might have gotten a better fight. They're both pretty even, so I think, going the distance again was to be expected. And I think that the problem with these guys is, I don't know, the fire and desire at some point. You get into a rut in the fight, and then, you're early on in the ball game, you're going 3 rounds. And, that used to not be the case with both guys who could be explosive, but now you kind of get that sinking feeling, and that's because they're older and not there. Mousasi, like you said, I do agree, may still have something to offer at the top level, but, he marches to the beat of his own drum, so I doubt we'll see him back in UFC.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to want that either, and I think that I'm interested to see what will happen to him if he fights Lovato again and doesn't get his title back. But I do definitely think that that's what's going to end up happening. I'm interested to see that rematch. But
I know both, Lovato Jr. and Mousasi have competed on events I've put together separately. That outcome surprised me a little bit. My hat's off to Lovato Jr. Lovato Jr. is one of those rare guys in modern MMA that right now
specialist.
Yeah, exactly. The Ben Askren types or the Kron Gracie types. Rafael Lovato Jr. is a jiu-jitsu through and through guy. That's what he comes with. And the fact that he was able to deal with the nuances and variances of Mousasi's game, my hat's off to him. But I think I'd still favor Mousasi in the rematch.
I think I would too, actually. I think that Mousasi tends to be better in rematches. He was against Uriah Hall. He was this time against Lyoto Machida. I actually agree with that. But on the topic of crossover fights, Bellator's having what I believe is their best Grand Prix to date. They started with heavyweight, which was a disaster. Welterweight was all right. Had some big highlights, big names in it. Venom Page, Koreshkov, McDonald, John Fitch, Lima. Now they're down at featherweight. They've already had 4 that happened, and last night they had the other 4, the first round of the 16-man tournament. So now we have 8. We have 8 fighters left. And last night, the champion of the featherweight division, who's also the champion of the lightweight division, Patricio Pitbull Ferreira, defended his belt in the co-main event against Juan Archuleta in the first round of this tournament. In my opinion, Pitbull, which I thought was very impressive last night against a very tough game challenger, and obviously coming off a big win over Michael Chandler, in my opinion, he is the best fighter in Bellator right now. And I believe that he is if there's any fight that I would look at when I look at Bellator and I look at the wide range of talent that they have, number 1 right now for sure of what I'd want to see would be Pitbull Ferreira against Max Holloway. After that, I'd probably say Lima McFarlane against Valentina Shevchenko. But there's light years difference even just between those two. Pitbull, to me, that is Bellator's ace in the hole right now of elite fighter that they have that's a double champion and deservedly so. Michael Chandler is a very elite fighter with a win over Eddie Alvarez back in the day. He goes in and knocks him out in the first round. Now he's back down at 45, so he's trying to defend both belts, and he's in a 16-man tournament to do it. If he comes out of this tournament winning against the stud young talent that they have in this tournament, and we're going to get to a little bit of them after this. Man, there's going to be some MMA hardcores who are going to look at Bellator and wonder, do they have the best featherweight in the world? Do they have one of the top 5 pound for pound fighters in the world when you look at Pitbull Ferreira?
Yeah, I think some people will ask that. And I think it's a legit question that should be asked. And I think that more notably, Bellator's failure gets highlighted by the people who won't ask that. So Ferreira's still going to be the champion for the second organization, even though on a personal level, I agree with you. I think he makes for an intriguing match and stuff. But, it would be interesting to see how you execute that, Could the UFC, trade their flyweight division for Patricio, Pitbull, get rid of that and send it over to Bellator, let them develop it and take another stud like that. I think the days of those trades and things that, were one and done, I don't think we'll see it again. But, yeah, Pitbull, I think we've been through a good handful of the roster. Even Bader, I think there's some value to Bader going back and seeing and answering some questions and things like that. I hate to keep harping on it, but, steroids and conditioning and that sort of stuff, as long as that's not an issue, nobody's suspended, and the guys are doing the things right, everybody's making decent money and they're able to, invest in nutritionists and things like that. And it shows. And Bader in particular, yeah, I think Bader's better in Bellator than he was when we saw him in UFC.
Oh, well, for sure. And I think a lot of that has to do with the talent. But just quickly recapping the other 3 fights, AJ McKee, who I think is Bellator's hottest prospect that they've groomed in-house, 15-0, all 15 fights in Bellator, 24 years old. He goes in and starches his opponent in 8 seconds with one of the quickest finishes in Bellator history. Darian Caldwell picks up a win. And
Caldwell's a pretty good fighter.
Darian Caldwell is a very good fighter. He's a former bantamweight champion there, and I think he looks physically better at featherweight. And also Daniel Weichel also won. Those were the 4 that won last night. They move on to the quarterfinals. But definitely the highlight of the night next to Pitbull defending his belt that I believe is probably when you look at the wide range of talent that's in this tournament, I think that they're already starting to signal that the what they expect, who the 2 favorites are, is getting to the finals and having Patricia Pitbull, the defending champion, dominant Bellator fighter, double champion, taking on this new prospect that's undefeated, young, running through guys, has fought every pro fight he's ever had in Bellator, in AJ McKee. And he goes in and looks very good last night. And it's just more of the same conversation. We've talked about it tonight. We've got Pitbull, who's a champion, but he's been a homegrown Bellator talent. We've got an entire tournament in the featherweight division right now that's just full of talent that's just solely in Bellator. Got names like Darian Caldwell, as you mentioned, another tough Bellator groomed fighter. Michael Venom Page, James Gallagher. You've been a little bit more pessimistic than I have about Bellator. I wasn't very high on them at the beginning of the year because it looked like the UFC world the MMA world was starting to split between West and East. Like everything, all the talent was starting to split between one championship and the UFC. Well, during the end of 2019, I'm not really seeing that, and I think the Bellator's had their best year yet. And I think that they're in a better position right now nearing the end of 2019 than they were even at the beginning of it. And I think it's because they're reviving Pride FC models with the Grand Prix. They've got some interesting champions. They've got guys like Lovato, who is undefeated as a champion. Scratch Bader, but go down, you got a very interesting welterweight bout between McDonald and Lima, who are probably two of the top 10 or 15 welterweights in the world, even if you throw them in the UFC rankings. And then they got a double champion with Pitbull, and they're at lightweight and featherweight. And then they got Horiguchi, who's a very top pound-for-pound prospect, they've been working with Ryzen over there and letting him go back and forth. And he goes in and gets a win over Caldwell. Caldwell moves back up, and he's a top prospect. They got names like Venom Page and Gallagher, and I'm seeing some potential with Bellator. And then you throw in AJ McKee, who has grown up in Bellator and is in this tournament and is kind of being aimed as like he's going to be the big challenger at the end of the line for Pitbull if they make it to the finale of this featherweight Grand Prix. So I'm having more of an optimistic view of Bellator right now than I have in a while. And, maybe Scott Coker's doing some good work and really aiming for the long term, and has used those old knockoff names to gain some attention, have some slugfest, but now he's starting to see also at the same time some young talent developing for the long game. I threw a lot out there, but what do you think?
I think AJ McKee's a nice story. I mean, the bottom line is in addition to that, for the historians and fans of the old school out there, he's a second-generation fighter. His father was a remarkably tough guy on the, B-class scene. Never made UFC because he was a wrestler-based guy that had a reputation for maybe a little bit of not a crowd-pleasing style and stuff like that. But resume-wise, he deserved it, and he probably got a little bit of a blackball and, didn't get a shot, mainly because of, the precedence for sluggers and things like that in the UFC. But it's good to see that the second generation, sometimes you get second generation guys that can't hold a candle to their fathers, like for example in the world of boxing, Julio Cesar Chavez, and then you've got the second generation, which becomes a 2.0. To go to a different sport, you've got the Del Curry, Steph Curry, model, where the 2.0 version is obviously in the son taking things to the next level. McKee has that potential. He looks like he's correcting some of the mistakes of his dad and fixing that reputation stuff, which at the end of the day, if you're not putting fannies in the seats and stuff like that, you carry that stigma his dad did. And what we see in McKee, some of the same things. He's a real dog, a very good athlete. And with that pedigree and stuff like that, I think you got a guy who's thinking, in terms of competition and fights and things. So, yeah, they brought him along well too. At 15-0, they've done a good job. I like that, because now that you've gotten to 15 fights, I'm glad they're bumping him now at 15 fights, and that they didn't go crazy when they were at 6-0 and be like, all right, now let's rush him in, with Shlemenko. I'm glad there are a few things that they protected him from. Some of that they do right. It's just closing the deal and making a star that they don't do good.
Yeah, the one that they just did so bad, they got just irrationally exuberant with, was Aaron Pico. And it's because he was so well groomed, really good wrestler, has a good boxing base too, young, handsome kid. But they were throwing him in there with like guys like Henry Corrales and Adam Boric and stuff way too soon. They did the total opposite with AJ McKee, and I think it's paying off. AJ McKee now has a lot of experience, and they've got another name that is adding a lot of unnecessary pressure to himself by acting like a total jackass everywhere he goes. But Dylan Danis is in Bellator, only has a few fights, an excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, training up there with, the same group of goons that we talked about earlier with Gallagher and Connor and all them, and has a lot of potential, young talent. How are they going to try to rush him in? I mean, can you imagine the mistake it would be for them to throw him in with Koreshkov or Venom Page or even Benson Henderson or any of them right now? I mean, they need to pump the brakes on some of these talent and let them groom. They did it so well with AJ McKee. They've done it so well with Patricio Pitbull.
They don't really need to pump the brakes, in my opinion. I'm sorry to cut you off because you're making excellent points here. But I think this is why I have a little bit of tempered optimism. My optimism gets tempered. I'm not as happy on Bellator. Now we're talking a little bit about depth. And I guarantee you half the names that you've mentioned are sitting at home wondering when their next fight is. Their schedule is not conducive to the development that is needed here. And without that solved, we're always going to have certain parts of the roster which has gotten more attention, advance, and get to a certain point. But when you're talking about solid across all weight classes and everything like that, they just don't have enough fights.
Do you think the zone will help with that? I mean, I don't know how long they have the TV package deal, but I would think that just moving 100% to zone would be the best move for Bellator right now.
Viacom owns them, right? And Viacom is a media TV entity, right? So if they're going to force them to be on TV, somebody over there has to stop thinking of it. We do pro wrestling and we do MMA, and MMA is Thursdays, and I don't know what day they pick, but Thursdays at 8:00. That's the time slot. You got 2 hours, produce a 2-hour TV show, and guess what? The schedule goes, I need a weekly show from August to November, and then you're off again till March. Guess what? It's a non-starter. You will not be able to develop the fighters the way the UFC does. It's just a non-starter with a schedule like that. And that is still what Bellator shows, 10 years down the line.
Yeah. So there's
if you have fighters wondering where their next fight is, and they're not injured, and they're not like that, and I believe that Bellator, a lot of the guys there, like Dylan Danis, it's been too long since we've seen him.
Mm-hmm.
It's already been too long. Where has he been? He's not injured, right? Where has he been? That's a shortcoming of their roster, because if the UFC wants to, they can take frontline guys, and we've seen this in the recent history. They'll take a couple of frontline guys and say, all right, I'm sticking you on the undercard, but you'll get your fight, and you'll be on there and whatever, and people are taking those fights and stuff. That's what the UFC can do with their, in the case of Rodriguez and Stevens, they're able to say, all right, we're going to do it again 3 weeks. Bellator would be literally having to add a show on short notice because they don't have any type of flexibility that way. So it's not an even playing field, and until they even out some of those things with their calendar and are able to match, that aspect of it, show for show with the UFC, then it's a non-starter. They won't compete. You'll get pockets of guys that are doing the work, but not a roster from top to bottom that can compete.
So in conclusion for the topic for the night, because we're doing this recap show for the weekend, but we've had kind of an overarching theme about discussing Bellator and what they got going on moving forward. We just kind of have mixed signals. They've got the talent. They're getting more talent. They're getting more organic, developed talent coming in. But it's your concern is more about the superstructure of the organization itself, being able to adequately provide a functional platform that can promote them and groom them and push them into stardom, compared to what the UFC has to offer.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have a good track record. There are no Ronda Rouseys or Conor McGregors or Chael Sonnens in Bellator's history. So that's
while we're here, though, Miguel, and I hate to interrupt you, but I don't want to lose this thought. How is, and this could take us off on a rabbit trail. We might be on this podcast for 30 more minutes with this question. How is Ariel Helwani still getting away with bringing on Bellator talent onto his Ariel Helwani MMA show, which is by far the biggest platform that any MMA fighter could go on to do an interview? I don't know of a single person that would disagree with that follows MMA. That getting interviewed with Ariel Helwani on Monday with him is typically, that's the platform that you go on. You get some name recognition. He's still bringing in fighters from one, presidents from one. Scott Coker goes on. A lot of Bellator fighters come on. How is ESPN doing that when they've got their eggs? Like, because Bellator, in order to really promote and push a fighter and groom them into stardom, they're going to have to get them onto stuff like that. They're going to have them on SportsCenter compared to like how Conor McGregor is. They're going to have a time when a Bellator event is a huge deal and it's a huge newsworthy story that's on the USA Today and the sports section's front page, like some UFC events are. And, this stuff is going big. But how can ESPN cater to that when they are now in the business of protecting the UFC, because that's their model. They own the UFC now. It's not like with the NBA. The NBA has some kind of counter competitor that's even close to competing with it, or the NFL or anything like that. So they can buy up products like that. And the NBA and the NFL, they go to ESPN, ABC, CBS, Fox, all these different things. With this, it's a little bit different. The UFC's pay-per-views are solely on ESPN+. How could they ever aid their competition on that network?
I think that's an astute question, but I do think that now you're on to a different power game. ESPN is a sports entity.
Yeah, that's true.
Sports includes MMA, right? So what you're worried about is, they cover us and Bellator, so that the UFC might come to somebody and say, hey, if not the UFC, maybe ESPN, as an interest in the UFC, says, dump Bellator. I don't want to see any coverage of Bellator on ESPN anymore. And that's it. They're dead. The UFC did that already. That's how they killed, most of the news websites that were around, that were independent sites, including SureDog and things like that. Those guys, the original guys, got bought out. Now it's a Yahoo website and stuff like that. So at any rate, they already got rid of the journalists that they could and bully and do that with. But at some point, ESPN does have to say, hey, look, we're also a news entity. We have to provide news. Those guys are on television and stuff like that. So it behooves us to present it as news only. And they can use subtle ways. You lead off with the UFC news, then you do baseball, football, basketball, and then you cover Bellator at the end of ESPN. Boom, mission accomplished.
I'm talking more about along the lines of when it gets really complicated, because we don't see this in MMA right now because Bellator doesn't have the big model. They don't really have huge fights yet. Their biggest one that they've had is probably coming up with Rory McDonald and Douglas Lima. But I'm talking more. We've seen it already this year about how ESPN handles it, and they just cover it. I just don't understand how they do it, because you look at where it's much more complicated, much more complex for them is in boxing, because they've got Top Rank over there on ESPN Plus right now with Eddie Hearn and stuff. But then they are still they were hardcore covering, and they had no choice to cover Andy Ruiz knocking out Anthony Joshua, or talking about Errol Spence fighting Sean Porter, and that was an Al Heyman, PBC, Fox, all that stuff that had nothing to do with Top Rank or ESPN. But they have no choice if they're gonna cover that adequately on ESPN and be, as like you said, a sports broadcasting network. They have to cover it. But at the same time, aren't they kind of Do you think that goes into the negotiation process, whether it's with Dana White in ESPN or Eddie Hearn in Top Rank, that, look, we still have to adequately cover your competitor? And if Canelo Alvarez and Golden Boy are throwing the biggest boxing bout of the year on DAZN with Triple G trilogy, it's going to be one of the top things we talk about on SportsCenter, even if we're in the business with Top Rank. We got no choice. You see what I'm saying? Like, if Bellator gets to a point where they have this massive fight, I'm talking they get to a point 5 years down the line where they have one of the hottest names in the sport, and they have the perfect B-side for him, and they have this massive pay-per-view, they have this massive gathering, all this attention is on this Bellator fight, and ESPN is, you turn on ESPN Plus and every other thing is the UFC. Is ESPN going to be shooting itself in the foot, and is it going to harm its relationship with the UFC for them to give preferential treatment to Bellator in the lead up to this massive fight in confrontation with their partnership with the UFC?
I think you brought up a very interesting point, and you probably brought up a battleground that'll be decided in the next maybe 18 months to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what kind of legs DAZN has, and if they're around in that period of time, or if they're starting to fade. I do think that there's still a lot coming in the distribution and media and stuff like that. And yeah, I think, there.
You there, Miguel?
Or stuff like that could come. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes once people are starting to really settle, circle the wagons kind of stuff. But I do think right now those relationships and ESPN and DAZN and stuff like that, people are still waiting to see their full impact in the business before you get that next step of like, okay, DAZN and Bellator really are starting to become a threat. They've gotten closer. We're not covering them anymore. That could be a natural progression. At the same time, the journalism stuff, ESPN is, bigger than any of the companies that we're talking about on their own, right? So they could always pull that ace, We have to, the news is the news. We got to do that. You'll have the full backing of everything we do distribution-wise, and you won't be sorry to be associated with us. But yeah, you're going to have to live with it. And is it something in negotiating? I don't think Hearn or any promoter, even the UFC, is in a position where they're going to dictate that to ESPN at this point. Maybe in a few years it might change, but I think ESPN has that veneer of you're with the big boys now, and you don't call the shots with them. You get what they give you.
I agree, and I think it would actually be shooting ESPN's. It would be really shooting their company in the foot if they didn't cover something like Joshua and Ruiz just to protect Eddie Hearn and Top Rank. So.
Right now, it's not the right perception,
Absolutely not. Absolutely. But this has been a great podcast, Miguel. We've covered everything very adequately and really went in depth about Bellator and its talent pool and its superstructure. I've appreciated this conversation. Wednesday, we're going to have a massive show, and we're going to talk. Not only we're going to preview a massive event going on next weekend with UFC 243 in Melbourne, Australia. Big, massive middleweight title bout. My favorite, probably the biggest middleweight bout, in my opinion, since probably Weidman and Silva. Very, very much looking forward to this fight. But Adesanya taking on champion Robert Whittaker, stadium show for the UFC. We got that. We're going to cover all the new. We're going to round up all the news. But this has been a good recap show of a very busy weekend in the UFC, in the world of MMA, and hopefully we don't have three big events to cover in the weeks coming forward. But good show, Miguel. Good talking with you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me. The bottom line is this. We talked about the Irish and the passion and the ethnic quality of MMA and how it should be used as a positive, for hyping fights and making fights and stuff. Watch this weekend, checking in the Kiwis and the Aussies with their passion. I think it's well worth watching as well.
Got it. Talk to you next time, Miguel.
Yes, sir.